Hello, welcome to the Rambling Kings podcast, hosted by me, Embrace Astoria. And today I'm finally talking about my personal favourite medieval king of England, Henry II, or Henry Fitz-Empress. But first I must apologise, it's been quite a few months since I've done a podcast, because I did want the podcast to be a regular occurring item on a monthly basis. That didn't happen because I was so fixated on getting 2 more episodes of the Medieval Kings of England series out, the promiscuous kings and the most famous events of each medieval king of England's reign. So now that I'm back to hopefully doing a monthly podcast, I'll be trying to pick really any king that catches my eye, and I was torn between Henry II and Richard III. And Henry II was a clear favourite over Richard III. So I will do Richard III at some point because he's a king that fascinates me as well, but Henry II is my favourite medieval king. He is, to my opinion, the personification of what a true medieval monarch is. And there's many reasons why I like King Henry II. His story is full of drama. Even from his earliest age, when he was a teenager, trying to take the throne of England from King Stephen, who had usurped it over his mother, the Empress Matilda. But I'm not normally one for drama. I hate television soaps like EastEnders, Emmerdale, Coronation Street, mainly because my mother used to always watch them and I hated them because it was the only television we had. So it was that or nothing else. And it always vexed me. I hated these shows. But with Henry, with that drama, it's not just him, but also his whole family, or collectively, the Angevins, the Angevin kings. But you could make your own TV show called The Angevin, starring Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and all of their sons and daughters. Because that's the crux of Henry's reign, is the arguments he has within his own family. It took his family to attempt to bring him down, and eventually it was finally Richard the Lionheart siding with King Philip, which brought him down. Although, at that point, Henry was suffering from a very painful ulcer, which eventually killed him. But why Henry II is that personification of a medieval king is down to his vast personal empire, which was based and built around his personality, the Angevin Empire. It wasn't an empire as such, but it was mainly holdings in France and in England that created the empire, which became very mixed up in the personality and personal rule of each of the Angevin kings, which are Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and finally King John, who loses it all. But the running of such a big personal empire is eventually what killed Henry, because he was so worn out. Even though he was in his 50s when he died, his legs were just bowed from all the horse riding, and he was just exhausted from running such a vast empire. But despite the vast empire, Henry II is mainly famous for, or at least when I first was introduced to him, for the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. So Henry, another reason why I liked Henry was he promoted men based on their own merits and their skills, as opposed to anointing sons of noblemen who might be competent in the job, or absolutely terrible. And the Angevin Empire itself is not something really Henry built, but it's something he inherited or married into. So first things first, he inherited Anjou from his father, Count Geoffrey, who died en route back from Paris, where I think Henry first met Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then, of course, the marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who previously was married to the King of France, but then they had that marriage dissolved, and pretty much afterwards she marries Henry, although Eleanor did have a few suitors trying to kidnap her, which one included Henry's younger brother. But marrying Eleanor gave Henry access to the very powerful Duchy of Aquitaine, which he could draw upon troops, men, money, power. And this is before he came to England to try and claim it back. So beforehand, Henry had already sort of tried to invade England before by hiring some mercenaries. It failed, and his mother and his uncle basically said to him, "You're on your own, kiddo, bugger off." So Henry, bizarrely and brilliantly, went to his rival for the throne, King Stephen, who then paid for him to be able to go back to France, which I always think is hilarious, but it also shows how kind-hearted Stephen was, because he gets a bit of a bad rep. I mean, obviously, because of the anarchy, because how I rate my kings is based on how well they look after the people, because that's essentially what a king is anointed for, is to look after the people of that realm before it all changes later on down the centuries. And this is why Henry, to me, is another great medieval king, and my personal favourite is how he dealt with rebels, because another aspect of Henry's rule was the Great Uprising, where it wasn't just his family going against him. It was the King of France, the King of Scotland, and loads of other allies. But Henry surviving that and mitigating the damage done to his realm is another reason why I rate him so highly. That's not to say Henry isn't without criticism. One is he invaded Wales quite a few times, and basically all of the exploits in Wales failed because he was needed elsewhere. This is the problem with the Angevin Empire, was it was so big he couldn't really afford to basically go and invade Wales, because Wales is quite hard to invade. It's very hilly, the weather's sometimes not great, and the Welsh are very fierce in defending their home. Then there's, of course, the Norman invasion of Ireland. Henry, again, only went once. That was just to get submissions from some of the Irish chieftains. But he basically left it up to certain men like Strongbow, one of the Marcher Lords in Wales. But advising him during the early part of his reign and ruling in his stead in certain locations is his ever-present mother, the Empress Matilda. She even chastised Henry for even thinking about invading Ireland, especially early in his reign, because she knew England needed fixing up. And another reason why I like Henry is because we have such an interesting source material from this period. You might not have heard of it, but it's called The Course of the Exchequer. And it's an incredibly useful resource for telling us how England was run during this period, how the financial transactions were done, how oaths of office were taken, and basically everything else in between. It's a highly useful resource. But reading the final paragraph of the introduction, if you know English history, it really sort of gives away the game that you can see how Parliament would start to become a thing. I'll read it out. The Exchequer has its own rules. They are not arbitrary, but rest on the decision of great men. And if they are observed scrupulously, individuals will get their rights, and your majesty will receive in full the revenue due to the treasury, which your generous hand, obeying your noble mind, may spend to the best advantage. You can see why, reading that, how King John became a shit, saying, hey, here's the revenue, you've got a sound, noble mind, you carry on, Chuck, you spend the money on whatever you want. I can see how Magna Carta and Parliament became a thing, reading that last extract from the introduction to the Course of the Exchequer. It's very funny, and there's a lot of content in it. So during the anarchy, where King Stephen versus Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, which eventually Henry won by becoming heir under King Stephen, the Exchequer kind of fell apart during the anarchy. It wasn't as efficient as it should be, and this is why Henry is considered a great medieval king, because he brought back the Exchequer to its full prowess of being able to effectively raise funds, issue rights, the King's Forest and the reasons of its name. Like, there's a lot in Book 1's content. I'll link it in the description, so if you want to download it and read it, you can. It's a very, very useful resource. There's various translations of it from at least 1901, but because it's such an important document, it gets retranslated, I think, like every 10 years and gets re-released. So it's a very, very important document to read through, and it gives you an example of how Henry ran his government and how effective it was during this period. So I've rambled on for a little bit about why I like Henry, so I'll try and put some structure back into the podcast now. And the next topic I'll talk about is how I first came across Henry II and how I first learnt about him. And as I'm from England, I learnt about him first from school. And the way they introduced Henry is not really about, obviously, the Course of the Exchequer or the Angevin Empire. Nope, the first thing that we're taught normally about Henry II is how he inadvertently caused the death of his one-time best friend, Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, because the murder was so shocking at the time, and is today. So if you look at the thumbnail art for this podcast on YouTube, obviously, if you're watching it elsewhere, Just have a quick look on YouTube. The image I've used next to Henry's portrait is an image or an illustration from a 1960s children's book explaining the argument between King Henry and Thomas Becket. And as you can imagine, as it's for children, the argument and the reasons behind it are severely simplified. Like if you said to a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, ecclesiastical matters, they'd probably look at you with an expression of, "What did you say? What is that word? I've never heard of that word." But the issue between Thomas Becket and King Henry II was really just down to church versus the state, as the king obviously is the physical embodiment of the state. And there's no worse an enemy than your previous best friend, because they know each other incredibly well. They can take jibes at each other that become incredibly personal. And we see a little bit of this with Henry and how he sometimes trolled Thomas Becket. One account which is recorded by Roger of Howden. He writes, "The said king assembled a great council at Northampton, where he inflicted great annoyances upon Thomas, the Archbishop of Canterbury." Henry had essentially left his horses to do whatever they wanted, and if you've been around horses, they tend to shit everywhere. So you can imagine Thomas Becket arriving and seeing horse shit everywhere in his lodgings, and not being a very happy bunny. The fallout between King Henry II and Thomas Becket is quite legendary. One aspect I really enjoy is that Thomas had written to Henry's mother. Now, Henry was a bit of a mama's boy. His mum advised him and helped run his government on his behalf in various locations across his empire. And Matilda was very much in Henry's camp. Of course she would be. It's her firstborn son, who is incredibly powerful, so of course she would want to protect his interests. And the letter she wrote to him is incredibly interesting, so I will just read it out now. "The Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, to Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, 1165. To Thomas, Archbishop of Canterbury, Matilda, the Empress. My Lord Pope sent to me, enjoining me, for the remission of my sins, to interfere to renew peace and concord between you and the king, my son, and to try to reconcile you to him. You, as you well know, have asked the same thing from me. Wherefore, with the more good will, for the honour of God and the Holy Church, I have begun and carefully treated of that affair. But it seems a very hard thing to the king, as well as to his barons and councils, seeing he so loved and honoured you, and appointed you lord of his whole kingdom and of all his lands, and raised you to the highest honour in the land, believing he might trust you rather than any other, and especially so, because he declares that you have, as far as you could, roused his whole kingdom against him. Nor was it your fault that you did not disinherit him by main force. Therefore I send you my faithful servant, Archdeacon Lawrence, that by him I may know your will in these affairs, and what sort of disposition you entertain towards my son, and how you intend to conduct yourself, if it should happen that he should fully grant my petition and prayers on your behalf. One thing I plainly tell you, that you cannot recover the king's favour except by great humility and most evident moderation. However, what you intend to do in this matter signify to me by my message and your letters." To summarise that letter, it's Empress Matilda basically telling Thomas Becket to get his shit together and realise where he's come from and what he owes to King Henry. Without him, he would not be in this grand position. The argument and fallout between King Henry and Thomas Becket was so bad that it wasn't just Empress Matilda getting involved, but also the King of France trying to reconcile the two, because they're supposed to work hand in hand together. This fallout between the king and the archbishop lasted until 1170, when a compromise was made between the two. But upon returning to England, Thomas Becket pissed off Henry again by excommunicating a bunch of clergymen, including the Archbishop of York. This is where we get to the famous bit of Henry's reign where he is really angry, really frustrated, and shouts "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" There's other lines Henry alleged shouted, which I've covered in the previous Medieval King episode, the most famous moment of each Medieval King of England's reign. But then the classic tale happens. The four knights hear Henry. They immediately go to Canterbury and kill Archbishop Thomas Becket. Roger of Howden names them, and he states that hardly had the father been residing 1 month in his see when, lo, on the 5th day of the feast of the Nativity of our Lord, there came to Canterbury 4 knights, or rather, sworn satellites of Satan, whose names were as follow: William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, Richard Britton, and Reginald Fitzurse, men of families remarkable for their respectability, but destined by their daring to commit so enormous a crime, to blemish the glories of knighthood and the honour of their ancestors. I do often wonder what Henry's face looked like when he heard the news that Thomas Becket had been murdered. He probably would have thought, oh no, because the political fallout was immense. Many archbishops wrote to Pope Alexander, who was the pope at the time, basically saying to put the lands of England under interdict, which is basically forbid them from performing certain rites within the church. This was a real reckoning for Henry's reign, and the fact that he managed to survive it and get around it is phenomenal, and another reason why he is one of my favourite kings, because the political fallout was immense, and he navigated it with a bit of luck as well. While most of Western Europe was freaking out about the murder of Thomas Becket, Henry was actually busy in Ireland securing submissions from some of the Irish lords there, as well as the invading Anglo-Normans. The Anglo-Normans had first arrived in Ireland on behalf of an Irish chief who had lost his kingdom, and that it created a free-fall effect where more and more Anglo-Normans were coming into Ireland. It also helped Henry that the Pope had basically said to him, yes, you can go and invade Ireland, because the Pope obviously wanted to control the Irish Church. What followed were bloody skirmishes, the odd agreement which would then be broken, and lots of castle building. One chronicler, known as Gerald of Wales, actually went to Ireland and wrote a great deal about the country and its people, in rather negative and in a sort of proto-imperialistic tones, basically saying that the Irish were this, they were bad at this, they were bad Christians, etc., giving basically Henry and the Anglo-Normans justification to say, hey, go and take Ireland because they're bad Christians. The source is called The Topography of Ireland. Again, I'll link it in the description. And it opens with, it has pleased your excellence, most invincible King of England, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, to dispatch me from your court in attendance on John, your beloved son, to Ireland. It's a land that's quite difficult to get to, and he had other obligations elsewhere, so he just left it to other people to deal with. One aspect of King Henry's reign that I really enjoy is the amount of castle building. So one of his grand, big projects that Henry built during his lifetime was Dover Castle, the Great Keep at Dover Castle. Dover Castle had been occupied for thousands of years. It's a very useful site because it overlooks the coast in Dover, and it's a good vantage point. So Henry built a magnificent keep there. So I had the pleasure of visiting Dover last year. It was on my holiday list. So the good thing about doing YouTube is, with my passion for history, they kind of work together quite well. They gel well together, because I can just go to a holiday destination that's also a historical place and then think, oh, I can take some photos, film some content, especially now that I've got this semi-professional video camera. So I went to Dover. I originally had gone to Canterbury, and I'll go back to Canterbury in a second. But the keep at Dover Castle is something I've always wanted to see, because it's the pinnacle of like King Henry's reign, like this big, strong, powerful keep that essentially at the time was impenetrable. And going through it, it's magnificent. And what's really nice is English Heritage, who run the site, have done it so it kind of resembles what we think it might have looked during Henry's reign. So we've got the gorgeous tapestry, the beautiful amount of colours, the dining room where, you know, it's all in a table where it's all together, and it just looks magnificent. It's so well put together, and the different sections of it are quite cool. So there's his bedroom, which shows all the gorgeous tapestry in there with the lovely amount of rugs in there, a sort of entertainment centre with a nice chessboard in there, and some religious iconography in there. But also the kitchens as well, what what we think kitchens would have looked like during the Middle Ages. So you've got like meat hanging, wash clothes everywhere, sort of intermingling. So it's really done well. The only issue is because it's such a historical building and an old building is the accessibility issues. So I work in museum work myself, and one of the big challenges we have with historical buildings like that is accessibility. Because if you're going to be putting in a lift for, say, people with disabilities or people who can't walk very far, the issue you have is where are you going to put that lift? Because if it's in a location where you think, oh, that might have been where something once was before, you're going to have to do an archaeological excavation. And then if you find things, you might not be able to put the lift in. And then ramps you can sort of get away with, but you can't really alter a Grade 1 listed building like that. So Dover Castle is fantastic. If you do ever visit it and you have mobility issues, please bear in mind that's going to be one challenge. You can actually stay in Dover Castle as well for quite an obscene amount of money, I must say. There's a wee cottage not far from the main keep, which you can stay in. I think it fits about 3 or 4 people. It's self-catering only. Although, interestingly, when I was walking past it, a group of Americans came out of it, and I started chatting with the lady there because she noticed I was British because I kind of stick out like a sore thumb. I'm incredibly pale. I like reflect the sun. But to be fair, I'm always bumping into Americans whenever I go to a major historical site in the UK. The Americans, I've noticed, they're kind of like the Flemish of the Middle Ages. They pop up in the weirdest places. But my favourite room in Dover Castle wasn't the throne room or the dining area or anything like that. It was an obscure little part of a shrine, or what would have been a shrine, tucked away in the corner. You have to sort of loop round some of the bits around the corner to find it. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll post an image so you can see what I'm on about. There's a lovely exhibition just outside of the main keep, which goes over why Henry built Dover Castle and the issues with his sons in his later reign, which I'll get to in a bit. But aside from Henry's grand keep, not far from Dover is Canterbury. Canterbury Cathedral, where Thomas Becket was murdered, is magnificent. It is probably one of the best cathedrals I've ever been to. I've been to a lot of cathedrals. I thought Winchester was great, but Canterbury Cathedral just has so much on offer. What's really nice about Canterbury Cathedral is the undercroft. You can't take any pictures in there, but it is so worth going. It's so big and just magnificent. It's glorious to explore. And obviously they have quite a few icons to Thomas Becket. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll be posting some pictures. But what's really nice is they have a wee candle in the centre of where Thomas Becket's shrine was. Before, obviously, you can guess what happened to it. 1538, Henry VIII and does his bloody thing of destroying many historical sites and iconography, the bastard. But what they do in the cathedral to represent Thomas Becket's shrine is they put a fresh candle out every day and then light it where it is. So if you go to Canterbury Cathedral and you look, you'll see the tomb of Henry IV on the left-hand side, and then Edward the Black Prince on the right-hand side, and then in the centre is this just a single candle to represent where his shrine was. But then there's some artwork to show a depiction of 3 swords showing the spot he was killed at, which is quite monumental when you go. So as I said earlier, this is why I love Henry's reign. It's just the drama. It's so fascinating to me to see all of this drama. And it must have been exhausting being like a page or a clerk in his court, and especially with the amount of travelling he did as well. You've just got so much going on, so much drama, not between just him and his sons and his wife, but with the King of France, who's always trying to curb Henry into a corner, and he does eventually with the Great Revolt. Now, during this time, Henry politically isn't as strong as he normally is. The death and murder of Thomas Becket really damaged his reputation within Christendom, and he had to make certain obligations and concessions to the church. One, he swore that he basically didn't order the murder of Thomas Becket, because if he had, he probably would have been excommunicated. In terms of concessions within the ecclesiastical matters, he had to abide by certain rules again, as well as allow certain things to happen. And also, he had to take up the cross, which Henry swore he would do, but he never did. He never went on crusade. But realistically, there wouldn't be much point for the church to punish Henry heavily. After all, Henry is one of the most powerful monarchs in the world at this point, and he would be needed for a grand crusade, because crusades are expensive. We know this because of, obviously, with what Richard the Lionheart did, and his capture basically forced the people of his realm to fund another crusade in terms of the ransom money. So having the most powerful king in the world at the time help you on a crusade, you can extract certain political concessions from that king. And that's essentially what the church was doing. If you read the absolution of the king by the church, it's quite an interesting read, as Henry would want to resolve any issues with the church because, as I said before, within his personal empire, it's really just putting out one fire after another. There's so much to do. There's so much to go and see. So going from Ireland to Milford Haven in Wales, and then back across the coast into Normandy from England, and then you find out that you've got to then go and sort out the borders of the Duchy of Aquitaine because the people there are revolting. It's a very exhausting process, and you can see why it would eventually kill Henry, and it would have eventually killed Richard had he not got obviously shot in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. And that's what I mean to keep emphasizing, is the fact that this empire of Henry's, this personal kingdoms he has, is just so exhausting for such a court to travel so much that eventually it would just catch up to him. And you can see that in the last entries of his life, where his legs like bowed. But now we come to the part where I really think Henry's political intelligence and everything that made his kingship so powerful comes to fruition. The Great Revolt. The Great Revolt can be summarized with really Henry the young king, Henry's eldest son, not his first son. His first son was William. He died in about 3 years old. But Henry the young king wanted more land and power, and he basically had, you could argue, bad people advising him. So one accusation is that there were a lot of selfish barons that were like, oh yeah, go and take your inheritance now, young Henry. You know, your father's weak, blah, 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 blah. And he fell for it, which eventually would cost him his life when he died from dysentery. The Great Revolt is the most dangerous moment of Henry's reign, but he does a very cunning, very powerful political and repentant statement. During this period, he does his penance for the death of Thomas Becket. I'll touch upon that in a moment, but going back to the Great Revolt, one of the other issues was Henry giving land to John, his youngest son, in exchange for a marriage alliance. Now, Henry the young king objected to this, and this is what really caused the rift to really start to blow open. Depending on the chronicles you read, the events unfold slightly different, but one chronicler I always enjoy reading for this time period is Roger of Howden's account. Now, Roger of Howden is incredibly biased against the French king. He doesn't like the French kings one bit. Reading an extract from it, he basically says that the French king always held the King of England in hatred. The French king was also Henry the young king's father-in-law, as Henry had married his daughter. So Henry the young king went to the King of France, and that basically started the whole revolt, because now he had the backing of the King of France, as well as the King of Scotland. This was a huge revolt that any king, I think, would have struggled to have put down, but given Henry's political intelligence and the fact that he had many loyal men under him, and the fact that it's the age of great castle buildings, helped to quell this revolt. The revolt lasted for just over a year. But one of the biggest surprises of the Great Revolt isn't the fact that it was men that had turned against Henry. It was the fact that his own wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had left and sided with her sons. Because remember, the King of France is Eleanor's ex-husband. They had divorced because essentially Eleanor hadn't provided a male heir, only 2 daughters. So it's very strange why she would suddenly betray a husband like that. And it's one of the questions I've seen a lot of historians try to answer, because the evidence from the chroniclers isn't great. They don't really give much of a nuance or a decent reason as to why she did it. Gerald of Wales basically says, oh, it's because, Henry had married the ex-wife of his liege lord in some other convoluted way. But all the others, Roger of Howden doesn't say anything. The reasons for neglecting Eleanor's role in this might be due to just good old-fashioned sexism from the chroniclers. One theory that always seems to pop up to explain why Eleanor betrayed Henry is that she was fed up with the many mistresses he had. The most famous mistress Henry had was called Fair Rosamond, and sometimes they like to pit women against each other, and Eleanor wanted to poison Fair Rosamond because she was jealous of her or something like that. But Henry and Eleanor were very compatible. They worked well together, and we see that in the fact that they had 8 children with each other. So the fact that Eleanor survived 10 childbirths is also impressive. But the long story is Henry and Eleanor did work well together. So we're not 100% sure why Eleanor betrayed Henry. If I had to make up a theory off the top of my head, the only thing I can think of is maybe she thought, oh, Henry's had his time in the sun, and maybe it's now time for someone else. But the problem with that is the revolt happened when young King Henry was only 18 years old. I know Henry himself was 16 when he inherited a lot of his land, but he was very inexperienced, and of course he was advised by his mother, Empress Matilda, who obviously at this point is long dead. So maybe Eleanor thought the same thing of, oh, I can get my son to have more of his inheritance, and then I can advise him through that. Eleanor loved her children dearly. When Richard the Lionheart was dying from his gangrenous wound, she was the one to hold him, to nurse him, and he died in her arms. So Eleanor may have been doing it on her own initiative to get her sons to have more inheritance. But Eleanor didn't really get the chance to help him out, as she was quickly captured. In one story, she was alleged to have dressed as a man to escape, but she was soon captured and imprisoned for the next 16 years. One location she was prominently held in was Old Sarum in Wiltshire. Henry the young king did gain many allies during this period. The King of Scotland, but he was promptly captured during a battle. One count was killed during a siege, but many of the nobles simply sat out and waited to see what would happen. This was the issue Henry had, the elder King Henry had, was that he had to wait and see who would declare for whom, and depending on how the wind blew, which had similar parallels to the anarchy. And this is again why I enjoy Henry's reign and consider him one of the greatest medieval kings, is he knew how bad it could get. He saw how bad the anarchy was. He saw royal authority get broken down. And the fact that he managed to beat all of his enemies in a timely period of 14 months is incredibly impressive. It also helped that this is the period of the great many sieges. You don't come across many set-piece battles during the reign of King Henry. In fact, he didn't even fight any of them. He came very close to fighting King Stephen one time and the King of France one time, but there was never a massive set-piece battle like the Battle of Lincoln during the Anarchy or the Battle of the Standard during the Anarchy. So Henry knew that if he stayed on the defensive, his castles should hold out for at least a good few months, maybe years even, because one of the most pinnacle sieges of the Anarchy is the Siege of Wallingford, which didn't fall at all during this period. It stayed under siege for years. But during the Great Revolt, we finally now come to the part where Henry does his great political theatre, the penance for the death of Thomas Becket. I'll read out my favourite account of what happened by Roger of Howden, and he starts with, on the day after this, he set out on a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Thomas the Martyr, Archbishop of Canterbury. On his approach, as soon as he was in sight of the church in which the body of the blessed martyr lay buried, he dismounted from the horse on which he rode, took off his shoes, and, barefoot and clad in woolen garments, walked 3 miles to the tomb of the martyr, with such humility and compunction of heart that it may be believed beyond a doubt to have been the work of him who looked downeth on the earth, and maketh it to tremble. Those who beheld them, his footsteps along the road on which he walked, seemed to be covered with blood, and really were so, for his tender feet being cut by the hard stones, a great quantity of blood flowed from them onto the ground. When he arrived at the tomb, it was a holy thing to see the affliction which he suffered, with sobs and tears, and the discipline to which he submitted from the hands of the bishops, and a great number of priests and monks. This act of penance would bear fruit for Henry, as not long afterwards the King of Scots was captured. Not long after this, the rest of the uprising was squashed, and young King Henry rejoined his father, until he revolted again a few years later and then died from dysentery. We sometimes think our families can be drama-filled, but then you look at Henry's and you're like, my goodness, that is a one dramatic family. Forget keeping up with the Kardashians, it's keeping up with the Angevins. The interesting thing about Henry's sons is they all pretty much inherited at least one striking aspect of Henry's personality. However, they all pretty much lacked political intelligence. The best example is King John, Henry's youngest son. He lost the Angevin Empire. Henry would die during the final revolt by Richard, who had sided with the French king. As Henry was dying, he was cursing his sons repeatedly, all of them, apart from his bastard son, Geoffrey, who was by his side as he was dying. But that's a heavily summarised version of the many events of Henry's reign. There's a lot to go over in Henry's reign, but now I want to focus on some of the other aspects of this podcast. And the next topic is the public perception of King Henry II. And now I actually have some data to back up what I'm going to be talking about. And unfortunately, Henry doesn't rate very highly on many people's lists. In fact, looking at the data from the YouGov website, which did this poll, asked about 10,000 plus people of various different ages, political alignments, etc., whether they had heard of the kings and whether they had a favourable or unfavourable opinion of the king. A lot of people put they had never really heard or didn't know about Henry II, which is a great shame. Henry's not even in the top 20. He doesn't really come into the list until about, I think it was number 22. So I've got my work cut out for me. If he's my favourite medieval king of England, and he doesn't really come up much for many Britons, then it's kind of a shame. They started from William the Conqueror, so they don't mention the Anglo-Saxon kings, which I kind of get, because if Henry II is under the category of most people don't know, at least in this very specific poll, then the Anglo-Saxon kings, you're going to have no chance. But if anything, it's given me more drive to carry on with the Medieval King series, so more people can learn various aspects or personality traits, or what we think we might know about the kings of England. I'll list the YouGov with the full data chart in the description tab, so if you want to have a read through it and see how it's broken down, because it goes from all the kings from 1066 to now, so up to Elizabeth II and Charles III. Elizabeth II obviously is number one because she's the most recent monarch and she had reigned for so long, whereas Charles has only reigned for about 2 years now. Public perception can change about King Henry if he's certainly featured in, say, a massive TV production or a massively successful film. And this goes into our final point of the podcast, the cultural representation of King Henry II. The first thing that springs to mind is the film The Lion in Winter from 1968, which stars Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn as Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, respectively, and a very young Timothy Dalton as King Philip. It's a very good film. It basically depicts the sort of drama that was within all of their lives, where they were arguing with each other and eventually siding against each other with different parties. And yeah, it's a very good film. Katharine Hepburn particularly really shines as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and there's a really nice scene where Henry and Eleanor realise they're quite old now, and they start reminiscing about the past, which I always thought was a nice touch. There is quite a lot of historical fictional books about King Henry. In terms of video games, which is always something I'm always interested in, he does appear in quite a few, obviously. I'm going to say it again. Crusader Kings 2, Crusader Kings 3, he appears in. Although I must criticise the two games because they don't do the anarchy very well, which is disappointing because it was such a long civil war and it kind of would make sense. Unless, of course, they're going to save it for a DLC for CK3. I don't know. They didn't for CK2. But one thing I always enjoy about the Crusader Kings games is the trait system, and they give Henry the appropriate traits. The only trait I disagreed with in CK3 was they had given Henry the wrathful trait. Now, Henry wasn't that wrathful. He was angry and rage-filled. He was famous for going on rage-filled rants. But wrathful, no, because he imprisoned Eleanor. That was the worst thing he did to her. But he gave very generous terms to his sons during the Great Revolt. All the other traits I agree with, but the wrathful one I didn't. The other traits like lust are definitely warranted. Henry certainly enjoyed a good old tumble. But yeah, there's not that many video games with Henry being depicted in, which is a surprise considering there's such a big genre of the Middle Ages. There's a lot of city builder games, and Kingdom Come Deliverance is a big game at the moment. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Henry featured in maybe some video games in the future, especially if they're based around his reign, because he did rule for quite some time. So maybe in the future we'll see more of Henry in video games. I certainly would like to see that. And for the final section of the podcast, I just wanted to mention some of the resources you can read to find out any information about Henry. I will, of course, link all of this in the description tab, but one I would always recommend reading is Roger of Howden's Chronicles, Gerald of Wales's Topography of Ireland and the Conquest of Ireland, the Deeds of William Marshall, Roger of Wendover's accounts, court rolls of King Henry's reign, and there's also quite a few biographies about King Henry written by historians. There's quite a few on Internet Archive if you want to have a look. One I really enjoyed was by a chap called Warren Lewis. I'll link, of course, all of this in the description tab. So if you want to do your own research or look up certain things I've mentioned, you can. The letter by Empress Matilda was in a book called Letters by the Queens of England by Anne Crawford. That was a book I found in a charity shop, which was an excellent find because it's got loads of letters from all the Queens of England, from the Middle Ages to later on. And if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, make sure you subscribe, like, and all of the fun stuff that apparently I have to say now when I'm doing these kind of videos / podcasts. But now we're slowly getting towards the nicer weather in the UK. I'm going to be hopefully going out more and doing a lot more filming. So some of the footage you've seen or the photos on this, if you're watching it on YouTube, there'll be a hell of a lot more hopefully this year. So that's one thing I'm really looking forward to doing this year is going out even more, exploring historical places and filming them. So it's a benefit to both you and me. So thank you all for listening, and I will hopefully speak to you all very soon. Bye.